Welcome back to Boilers and Beyond. I'm Jordan Jones, back here today on the final day of April, Sunday afternoon as I record this. And the final day of April has taken a little bit of a new meaning in the world of college football in the transfer portal era because it is the final day for players to enter during the spring transfer portal window. Purdue has been very active both adding and subtracting players here in this 15-day period in the spring. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what Purdue has lost to the transfer portal, what Purdue has added to this point, and what Purdue is going to seek to add, because during this cycle, you do not have to find your new home. You just have to enter your name in the portal. So I'm recording this around 3 o'clock on Sunday afternoon. If you're listening to this and a big player or something has entered the transfer portal, my apologies. This is when it worked best for me to get this recorded, so we'll do that today. Additionally, the NFL draft took place over the weekend, and I think I'm going to start there because 5 Purdue players got drafted, the most since 2004. A really good draft weekend for Purdue. So let's start with that. Purdue has 5 players go in the NFL draft, and if you ask me, it was rather fitting that all 5 of them went because, these guys were kind of the core of Purdue's team last year. Yes, Purdue had plenty of solid players last year. Some of them are back. Some of them have transferred, but some of them graduated. The main, kind of the core 5 players, though, were the 5 who were drafted. Aiden O'Connell, Charlie Jones, Payne Durham, Jalen Graham, and Corey Trice. If you ask me, those were kind of the core guys. All of them but Jones, came to Purdue out of high school, really developed well. I think you could say that about all 4 of those guys. And then Charlie Jones was kind of his own path, a very unique one with Charlie Jones. But, as a whole, this is a really good thing for Purdue. I've talked about this kind of on every post-NFL draft show I've had in the 3 years of doing this podcast. Purdue, for a program of its size, of its magnitude, Purdue is not some historically elite program by any means. Purdue is a good program, don't get me wrong there, but Purdue's not an Alabama, even, in the Big Ten. Purdue's not a Michigan or an Ohio State, but it has had more than its share of quality NFL players for kind of the overall history of the program. Of course, you have the quarterbacks, you have some of the defensive ends, you have Rod Woodson, some really, really good NFL players from Purdue. But during the early to mid 2000s, as those Joe Tiller era guys fizzled out of the league and retired, Purdue was not replacing them very well. And the list of Purdue guys in the NFL got rather thin. One of the best things I think you can say about the last 6 years at Purdue is that Jeff Brom really brought in some higher end talent than what Purdue was used to having and turned that into NFL draft picks. You look at George Karlaftis becoming a first rounder, Purdue's first one since Ryan Kerrigan, and would that have been 2011, 2010 maybe? That was a big deal. I think you look at Rondale Moore and David Bell going in the second day as big deals, and some guys, who are kind of sticking in the NFL. Jawan Bentley's off to a great start. Derek Barnes has done some nice things in Detroit. But this year you see 5 guys get scooped up, and it wasn't a sure thing, especially on Jalen Graham. He was kind of the guy that seemed to be the biggest question mark. He gets scooped up really late. Corey Trice falling in the draft was interesting. I suspect that has to do with some medical stuff. You'll remember he barely played in 2021 as he hurt his ankle in practice ahead of the Notre Dame game, and then tore that ACL in practice a couple weeks later after he was cleared to return. I would suspect some of his slip had to do with that, because really at the combine, he excelled. He ran a great 40-yard dash. He was strong. Overall, he tested really, really well. So for him to go in the 7th round, I think something had to happen with those medicals. Aiden O'Connell becomes a draft pick at quarterback for Purdue, the first Purdue quarterback to get drafted since Curtis Painter, all the way back in 2009. And I think the Raiders might be a decent spot for him there. You know, I don't claim to be some NFL expert. I really only follow the Chicago Bears closely. I have plenty of friends that keep me up to date on the Colts, but, you know, the Bears are really the one team that I can claim to know a decent amount. I cannot claim to know much about the Raiders, but, you know, Jimmy Garoppolo's their starting quarterback. I feel like he gets hurt every year. It wouldn't shock me if Aiden O'Connell, if he wins that backup job, you know, it's possible that he could get some action in year 1 in the NFL. Something that was unfathomable for a guy who came in and, you know, as was documented, was the 8th string quarterback, came in as a walk-on, only offer was from Wheaton College. A crazy story for Aiden O'Connell there. So it's good to see him get scooped up. Charlie Jones and Payne Durham, you know, look, the league is moving in a passing direction. And I think both of those guys have real value. Payne Durham's not going to wow you with athleticism, but he was rock solid as Purdue's number 1 tight end for 3 years. And we saw what Charlie Jones was capable of last year. And what we didn't get to see from him much was his special teams ability. You know, he was the Big Ten return man of the year when he was at Iowa. Obviously at Purdue, he could not be the return man that he was at Iowa because Purdue could not afford him to get hurt on special teams. They had to do all they could to keep him out there with the offense. So I think his role as a returner could really be big in the NFL. You know, there's only so much to say, though, for guys who are third-day picks. It can be hit or miss sometimes. If you want, you know, there are plenty of reasons why these guys can stick and have good NFL careers. And, you know, if you choose to look at it from a skeptical approach, well, you know, I think there's going to be plenty to justify that as well. But for Purdue to put 5 guys in the draft, I think is a big deal. Purdue had the 4th most players drafted out of the Big Ten. They were only behind Michigan, Ohio State, Penn State. That's really good. That's a good thing to have. Now, you didn't have the high-end draft guys, the way Iowa did with a couple of first-rounders, the way Illinois did with Devin Witherspoon going 5th overall, but you had some volume there. And I always maintain about NFL draft picks, you know, yes, it's good for recruiting in the sense that you can point at, oh, you know, we have XYZ NFL draft picks. But I think the biggest thing when it comes to recruiting in the NFL draft is having draft picks doesn't guarantee you anything, but not having them will certainly be used against you on the recruiting trail. You can bet Tom Allen is going to have to combat that on the recruiting trail after being the only Big Ten program to not have a player drafted this past year. That's certainly something that'll be pointed at. I would be remiss here if I didn't point out the Illinois defensive backs, Devin Witherspoon going in the 1st round, then Quan Martin and Sidney Brown going later on. That's kind of Ryan Walters' thing right there. He took a lot of pride in that secondary he had at Illinois. Those guys are all legit. They're all really good players. But that's something that Ryan Walters can kind of put his name behind too, and pros that he can claim. I think this was a really good NFL draft for Purdue. You look ahead to next year, it's very early to start projecting out, but may or may not be quite as strong. But for right now, Purdue is starting to get a little bit more solid of a base again in the NFL and of guys who project out as long-term NFL pieces. And that's really, really good for the brand of Purdue football. But now getting a little bit into, again, kind of the main reason why we're here today, talking about the transfer portal. This is really Purdue's first big year of a roster flip in the portal. Purdue, by the count I'm kind of looking at right now, Purdue's got 20 guys who have left, dating back to the start of the transfer portal, after the Big Ten championship game. Look, that's kind of the status quo now. I don't know that it's going to be that high every year. I think a new coaching staff and new leadership has a lot to do with that. You saw a few of these guys jump in the portal as soon as the season ended, or as soon as Jeff Brom departed for Louisville. So be it. This is kind of how it's going to go, though. You've seen this with a lot of new coaches across the country. Not all of them have been quite as pompous about it as Deion Sanders at Colorado, having like 52 guys transfer out. That's certainly a little bit different than what Purdue's having here, but make no mistake, this roster is going to look a lot different next year, and the vast majority of these portal changes, if you ask me, aren't exactly disappointing to the new staff. They need roster space. They need to have the ability to go add through the portal at positions of need. And that's just part of it here. It's a weird spot Purdue is in here because Purdue won the Big Ten West last year in a really weird year. 8-4 doesn't win you a division very often. It did last year. You sure as hell do not apologize for it. But your 5 best players from that team all just got drafted. You had 3 of your starters on the defensive line hop in the portal, all of them landing at Power 5 programs. You've had 2 offensive line starters portal out. The loss of Eric Miller earlier this week was something that I do not think Purdue wanted at all. Not that Eric Miller is, the next first-round offensive lineman, face of the franchise left tackle, like a Paris Johnson or a Darnell Wright. But what he is someone who's played a lot of snaps at right tackle for you. Losing that is disappointing. It's a very different team than what it was last year, and having the same expectations would be foolish. It's not a rebuild, but there's a lot of reloading that needs to go on here. And, some of these guys who have transferred out, you haven't heard a lot of. You look at just today, Purdue has Jordan Buchanan, Tristan Cox, and Brandon Calloway hop in the portal. That's not to say that these guys are bad football players. It's not to say that these guys aren't going to go be nice contributors somewhere else, but they didn't do much at Purdue. And when you are kind of putting together an outlook, these losses in the portal don't exactly change much. So you kind of live with that. Brady Allen was certainly the most high-profile one, entering the portal for the second time. But, I think at the end of the day, it might not be the right fit in this new offensive scheme. And sometimes that happens. He was someone who probably fit much better in the Jeff Brom scheme, which is much different than what Graham Harrell is going to want to do here in terms of a passing attack. So be it. I have no idea how he was kind of progressing overall. A lot of questions there in terms of, how good he is, how good he isn't. We have no idea. Time will tell there. But if you look at what Purdue's brought in the transfer portal, Hudson Card was brought in to be the QB1. He is going to be Purdue's starter. That much was made clear right away. Now, I will add, Purdue probably needs a backup quarterback now. You have Ryan Brown, the true freshman who just came in, and you have a bevy of walk-ons. That's about it here right now. Purdue had Chance Nolan from Oregon State on a visit. He elected to go elsewhere. That would have been great. That would have been a great backup piece. But selling to a guy that you're going to come be the backup is much easier said than done. Purdue's going to have some trouble getting that, but it's not to say that they can't do it. I think one thing is very clear, that the defensive backfield needs to be overhauled. Purdue has picked up a couple of corners already. They picked up a safety in the first cycle. I think they're still trying to add there. Now, they've lost some of the corners that they had in the fold already. You know, you look at Brandon Callaway, Javon Grigsby, Jordan Buchanan. All those guys are corners that you lost. But I think Ricky Smith as well in there. I think Purdue's just trying to get a much different look in the defensive backfield, get guys that fit that very unique scheme that Ryan Walters wants to play. But as we've seen, if you have good guys back there, that defense is going to be really, really good if you just look at what he did at Illinois last year. That would be a big deal. Purdue's added a couple offensive line depth pieces more than anything. A couple guys that are probably going to be interior offensive linemen. In a perfect world, you'd go get an offensive tackle to kind of replace Eric Miller at this point. But getting guys to play, getting tackles out of the portal is easier said than done. There are very few programs in America that don't sit here today on April 30th and say, man, if we could add another offensive tackle that's capable of starting, I would love to. I think everyone wants that. It's a major, major challenge. What Purdue's going to be able to do there in the portal from here on out, I don't know. Kind of rounding out the offense, they picked up a wide receiver, Jamal Edrine from Florida Atlantic. That's a guy who, you know, probably projects as more of a depth piece at the wide receiver room. But Purdue needs that. Purdue needs guys who are capable of coming in and being solid players. I think if they could get a big-time receiver, they would absolutely take him. You know, someone who could come in and be a no-doubt starter. I think we'll see Purdue go after that here in the coming days, coming weeks. On the defensive side of the ball, you know, it was kind of something that we knew was happening at the time, but I don't know that we really understood the magnitude of losing Jack Sullivan, Branson Dean, and Lawrence Johnson to the transfer portal. I think that, you know, really was a bummer. Now, I don't know that Purdue was kind of internally projecting those guys to come back. So I think it's hard to say that that was, you know, some giant unexpected loss. But, man, would it have been nice for Purdue to have those guys in the fold? That would really change how you feel about this defense because, you know, they're really trying to overhaul the defensive backfield, and I think you feel good about what Purdue has on the edge with their edge rushers, with Nick Carraway, with Kydron Jenkins, with Corday Sidnor, but I don't think you feel as good about what you have on the interior of the defensive line, and I don't think you feel as good about what you have at linebacker. So stopping the run is going to be an interesting challenge, an interesting task for Purdue this year. It's not to say they're not going to be able to do it, because I'm sure they, you know, they're working on it without a doubt, but that's going to be an area where I think Purdue, they've got some help on the defensive line. They got the kid from Auburn, who I think they're really excited about. The big guy from Vanderbilt. Back in the first portal, they took the defensive tackle from Arkansas. So they're getting some help there. But, as a whole, we'll see what they can do. I do think, going back to the corners for a minute, Salim Turner Muhammad from Stanford and Marquise Wilson from Penn State, I think Purdue is going to be expecting those guys to start right away, along with Jamari Brown. I think that's going to be the expectation for those guys. They're both more veteran pieces. They're not necessarily young guys who are getting out early. They're guys who have been around a while. And I think Purdue's really going to hope that those guys can be big contributors right away. Whether Purdue loses anyone else, I don't know. The one thing I'll add here is that the deadline that is approaching here, in 9 hours as I record this, that is only for undergraduate transfers to enter the portal. If you are a grad transfer, the one-time thing does not apply to you. You can transfer again, no problem, and you can enter at any time. So it is entirely possible that, Purdue could lose more later on in the cycle, guys who have graduated from Purdue. I don't know. I don't know what to expect there, but it's a possibility. And I think it's entirely possible that, Purdue keeps shopping this as long as possible. I don't know. I don't know that you're ever going to feel fantastic about what you have going into the season in this era, unless you're, a Georgia or a Ohio State or a Michigan type. But I think for Purdue, anything they can get to kind of bolster that roster is going to be welcomed with open arms. Anyone that can be a starting caliber player, I think they're going to sign up for in a heartbeat. Anyone that can be an instant impact type, you're going to take. You've seen them be pretty aggressive here. I think if you can say one thing about Ryan Walters and company at this point, it's that they understand the importance of having talent on the roster. And while it sounds, obvious that you need talent, they understand that Purdue still has a little bit of a ways to go in order to get to where they want to be this fall, in order to get back to a bowl game and compete for kind of the upper middle part of the Big Ten West. A long way to go, obviously. We still have, 4 full months, May, June, July, August to go before the season gets underway. Way too early to start making predictions and projections, but certainly at least worth pointing out here that Purdue is very active in trying to flip this roster, very active in trying to get this roster to be a bowl roster, I think is probably the way you're going to look at it here for this upcoming season. That's kind of all I have for today. I know this is a bit shorter of an episode, but there's only so much to say. Sometimes with these transfer portal pieces, you only know so much. Purdue's still very active. They're not done yet, but whether Purdue loses more or not remains to be seen. As I said, though, I think to this point, Purdue has really only lost, at least in the spring period especially, I think Eric Miller is really the only one that you're super sad to see go. I think Purdue feels that they can replace the rest of these guys. So that's all I've got for today. We will be back here soon to talk about anything else that happens in the transfer portal. Keep an eye on basketball. Keep an eye on everything. But until then, follow along on Twitter at Boilers Beyond. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Don't miss an episode. We'll be here all summer getting you ready on the countdown to kickoff, and we'll talk about basketball as well, too. Send over any ideas you have. I'm all ears. Until next time, guys, take care and be safe out there.